Yes.
Good morning, everybody. Welcome. I'm very glad that you were able to join our discussion on the state of Russian studies in the U.S. I'm very excited to be moderating this discussion because the time couldn't be more appropriate, considering the current crisis in Russia-U.S. relations. Today we have a panel of five highly regarded speakers. Each of them come from diverse background, and they will be able to contribute to our discussion, adding their unique perspective on Russian studies in the U.S. I believe all of you have their biographies, so I'm not going to read full biographies, just briefly. Jeffrey Mankoff is Deputy Director and Fellow with the Center for Strategic International Studies, Russia and Eurasia Program. Please welcome Jeffrey. Oleg Burmistrov, Minister Counselor of the Embassy of the Russian Federation to the United States of America. Nikolai Petrov is Professor of Political Science at the University of Rhode Island, specializing in Russia and its neighboring states. And Nikolai, as well as Jeffrey, is author of our special report on Russian studies. And Olga Miller, she's the head of the office for the Renova Group of Companies in the United States. Last but not least, Anton Fedyashin is director of the Carmel Institute of Russian Culture and History at American University. Before starting our discussion, I would like to go through some rules. I expect that we will have a discussion among us for about 30 minutes, and then I would like to open it to our audience, because I'm sure that you will have questions and you would like to add your comments with regard to the topic. However, since we have only 1 hour, I would like all of you to be as brief and concise as possible. So please try to talk for no longer than 4 minutes. After 4 minutes, I will have to stop you. Also, our discussion is live streamed today, and you or anybody who is following our discussion online will be able to ask their questions using hashtag #RussiaStudies. Also, I just wanted to briefly tell about our report. It is a special issue that Russia Direct has released, and you have this report in your folders. It analyzes the field of Russian studies, and it also contains our original methodology that ranks Russian studies programs in the US. You can also download this report on our website if you go to the archive section. All right, let's begin. Nikolai, I would like to start with you. I know that you have a highly critical view on the state of Russian studies. In our report, you even wrote that a proper field of Russian studies has yet to be developed in the US. Is that right?
Well, since I wrote it, yeah. But the basic reasons, I think, can be summed up in a set of confrontational assumptions. And I've often asked myself how far back these confrontational assumptions go, because I know there have been colleagues in the past, people like Martin Malia or even James Billington, who trace it back to religious confrontations, to the Byzantine era, and to divergent paths of development. And all of those certainly play a role. But I think there's two things that I highlight in my section of this report. One is the relative isolation. A lot of people have noticed, of the United States from Russia historically. There simply wasn't a lot of contact. And the reason for the emergence of contacts was in the post-World War II era and the growing areas of tension and contact that led to conflict during the Cold War. But whereas a lot of people do talk about Cold War thinking, I think our confrontational assumptions do have a deeper root and probably lie in the perceptions of Russia as a nemesis, a useful other to the United States. One which, whenever there's this sort of nemesis image created, it also serves as a rallying point for both parties. So there are actual benefits to having a nemesis when you're jockeying for global position, which I think a lot of what the Cold War was about. And I think one of the indicators of this persistent confrontation over the course of the past decade or so, as we moved out of the Cold War era as an appropriate label for our relations, we've replaced it with something equally dubious, which is the term values gap. And the values gap is something that I see is largely contrived and useful specifically for creating an image of confrontation.
Oleg, what is your perspective on the state of Russian studies, or in general, what's the attitude of the Russian embassy to the state of Russian studies in the US today?
Let me be a little bit academic now and share you just a couple of minutes in our general views on the place of Russian language and Russian studies in the United States. So just some numbers. The number of people learning Russian in the US is about, to our estimates, is 43,000. Russian language is taught in more than 3,500 educational institutes, including 130 universities. Most well-known are military and naval academies in West Point, Monterey, Annapolis, etc. That is the places where they still need good Russian experts. Now, among the U.S. East Coast universities, Russian is taught in George Mason, Georgetown, George Washington, Johns Hopkins, Maryland, Pennsylvania. On the West Coast and in the central part are the universities of Washington, Wisconsin, Michigan, Minnesota, Indiana, Oklahoma, Ohio, and many others, with about or more than 100 students in each university. More and more Americans are willing to study Russian in Russian institutes. Annually, about 500 students are involved into semester programs. Over 100 joined summer schools. Most well-known are projects in St. Petersburg, Voronezh, and Vladimir. Learning via internet has been becoming increasingly widespread as well. Every year, the Russian Federation allocates funds from the federal budget to finance education of foreign students, and Americans have this certain quota in this. So, summing up these numbers, we may say that the demand for the Russian language in the US is stable. Still, improving the situation is essential, and in this regard, the development of exchange programs for students, teachers, and young specialists becomes crucial. But we have problems, of course, more and more. A serious constraint for the development of educational exchanges is the absence of the bilateral agreement of the mutual recognition of educational documents. The necessity to have this paper became obvious several years ago, and the negotiations started within the framework of the working group of the bilateral presidential commission. But you know that in early last year, yes, this commission, which by the way consisted of more than 20 groups in all spheres of our cooperation at that time, was frozen by the U.S. Administration, and that has demolished the institutional basis needed for the whole complex of the bilateral relations. Another impediment is a restrictive visa regime between our countries. Russia has suggested several times different options on how to facilitate the visa procedures and eventually achieve a visa-free regime in the future. And we are not turning this option down. One more point. On the past decade, Russia and the US have failed to significantly increase our bilateral turnover, strengthen our economic ties. And this fact limits an interest of business in Russian studies, of course. At the same time, the interest in Russia is rising and information is needed about our country. And as a result, I want to stress about the niche of professionals now is filled by dilettantes and amateurs who do not possess necessary expert knowledge and skills. And I'm convinced that thanks to today's discussion, we might find possible ways out. Thank you.
Jeffrey, what is your attitude to the level of or the quality of expertise on Russia in the US?
Well, I think it's certainly variable. And I think, you know, as we've heard, one of the problems is that like a lot of the institutional apparatus for Russian studies in the United States dates from the Cold War. And I think a lot of the mindset also dates from that period. And, you know, there's been a quite significant underinvestment in renewing the institutional pillars of Russian studies since the Cold War ended. And in part, I think that's because when you look at federal funding for education in the United States, obviously, to a significant degree, that's driven by perceptions of what national priorities have to be. And so during the Cold War, obviously, studying what was then the Soviet Union was a high national priority, and there was a lot of federal dollars that were going into programs to study what was then the Soviet Union. And there was, it's a supply and demand issue, that if the supply of resources is there, that in some ways is going to create its own demand. When the Cold War ended, a lot of that went away. The supply went elsewhere. And if you look at federal spending for scholarships and exchange programs, the Title VIII program, which almost went away, it's just been declining fairly substantially. And partially as a result, I think what we've had is difficulty renewing the cadres of people who are involved in training the next generation of Russian specialists. And so there's kind of this gap that I see that it's beginning to change now, as once again there's more focus on Russia as an area that the United States as a nation has to care about. But for the better part of the last 2 decades, I think that hasn't really been the case. And so in a lot of ways, we're still operating on the basis of institutions and individuals and approaches and programs that were designed for a very different era and that haven't really had the fundamental rethink for how they're applicable, what role they should play, and what kind of resources they should provide for an era that's defined in very different ways. And if you look at a lot of the debate around the current crisis, it's a little bit depressing in some ways, the extent to which we're falling back on a lot of these old tropes, a lot of these old stereotypes. And I think that's because we've spent so long living off of the seed corn that was planted 30 more years ago. There just hasn't really been that process of renewal underway. And this, if there's ever a time to fundamentally think about what is the nature of the Russian studies that we need as a country, this would be a great time to do it. The other thing I would say is because there hasn't really been this focus on Russia as an area of priority. A lot of the institutional partnerships that universities are increasingly focusing on elsewhere in the world haven't really been developed with Russia. I mean, if you look at the role of university partnerships that American universities have in places like China, the Middle East, and Southeast Asia, these have developed very, very rapidly. You have, I teach part-time at Georgetown, so Georgetown has a satellite campus in Doha, in Qatar. There are a lot of other American universities that have campuses in Doha or in Dubai or elsewhere in the Middle East. Some are in places like Singapore, Hong Kong, and there are partnerships with universities in India and mainland China. I just don't see that happening with Russia. And I think in part it goes back to a question of prioritization. I think in part it goes back to the bureaucratic nature of signing these agreements. It's just very difficult for these kind of partnerships to work in the Russian institutional environment, and finding Russian partners to work with, I think has been quite difficult for a lot of universities as well. But at the same time, it's this issue of prioritization. Because Russia hasn't been an area that, as a country, we've devoted a lot of resources or attention to for the last 20 plus years. I think that applies just as much to the academic sector as it does to the government sector, as it does to the business sector, as it does to any other sector. And in a lot of ways today, what we're doing is playing catch up.
Anton, do you agree that it's hard to develop partnerships with Russian universities and just Russian entities in general?
Excuse me, please. Could you please speak louder because people can't hear us on the live stream? Thank you very much.
I agree that there are logistical problems to overcome in creating partnerships, which it's never an easy process. But here's what we've noticed at American University. I run the Carmel Institute, and we have been inundated with requests by Russian universities to establish direct exchange programs. Inundated. And I can read you a list, including the Yurga State University of Khanty-Mansiysk, among many, many others. It's really remarkable how the Russian educational system is very consciously turning towards Western universities, specifically American ones. We spearheaded the establishment of a direct student exchange agreement between American University and GIMO and the Higher School of Economics in Russia. Now, those are no-brainers because they already have established exchange programs. They have had them for decades in the case of GIMO. Part of the problem is the transfer of credits, for example, from Russian universities back to American ones and vice versa. But that's going to take time to overcome. We were, for example, approached 3 years ago by a formerly closed Soviet establishment, the Moscow Institute of Engineers, who are now really kind of falling over themselves to kickstart international student programs and exchanges, because they've come to the conclusion that the best thing that can happen to Russia is for its educational establishment to open to the rest of the world. And it's really remarkable how passionate the Russians that have visited us. Officially, by the way, there have been 12 universities that have approached us to start establishing all of these programs. So there's no lack of desire on the Russian part. There is, however, a question of infrastructure, credits, programs on the ground that know how to work with foreign students, have all sorts of problem-solving know-how on the ground. Moreover, since the crisis has started with Ukraine, I teach at the history department at American University in addition to running the Carmel Institute. Our enrollments in Russian classes and East European classes are up. And unfortunately, this is the nature of these crises, stimulate growth of interest in the respective area, which is why China became such a big issue in the 1990s, and then of course the Middle East in the early 2000s. And now Russia's kind of coming back. And it's remarkable that there's been so many cuts to funding for Russian programs here in the US, precisely at the moment when you would think that that money needs to go into these programs. I do want to mention one thing that no one has mentioned before, though I agree with all the statements that have been made here so far. I got my master's at Harvard University at the Davis Center in the late 1990s. And it's a great program. We had a great student body with super professors. Nick Colton was running the place back then. But there was something interesting that I noticed while studying there, which was that the overall approach by the Russian studies community in the 1990s towards Russia had more to do with studying the theory of democratic transitions and economic development than it had to do with Russia per se, with Russian history, with Russian literature, or even with Russian economics. So theory kind of supplanted regional studies, and that's not a terribly good thing. And I'm hoping that this crisis will act as sort of a wake-up call to the importance of geography, geopolitics, history, and even more importantly, I would say the study of conservative thought in every single country. It's my pet theory that conservatism actually reflects usually the dominant beliefs in a society versus the non-conservative trend of thought. Like it or not, I'm not making a moral judgment about this, but that is very often how it is. And that should be the focus of Russian study programs going forward. That's what I would recommend. I think I'm done with my 3 minutes. Okay.
Yes. Olga, you represent a business perspective in this panel discussion. Can you share your attitude towards this field? Do you see what's your attitude towards
So basically, when I prepared for this, I was very diligent. I prepared to answer one question: what's my view of Russian studies? And it's interesting to hear the perspectives here. Basically, I told myself I'll be as constructive as possible today. And one thing that I will say, it's good that the programs still exist. And that's probably the premise that everybody should focus on right now as a focal point. But do we need more programs? Probably not. Probably the current number that we have is good enough. But what we do need, and I entirely agree with Anton here, we need the quality of programs. What we've had for the past 25 years, and I come from a different perspective again. I'm a funder and I'm an observer, but I feel that the quality has been very, the breadth has been very, not very good, to say the least. And we just started, I shouldn't say that, we just provided some seed money for a program that started at Yale University by Tom Graham, a fantastic new program called Contemporary Russia. And the reason we funded it, co-funded it with a few other funders, was exactly that. I feel that currently the Russian studies field is extremely shallow. It's focused on diversions of spheres, but nothing has the breadth that Russian studies really deserve right now. And what we're trying to do, what Tom Graham is trying to do at Yale, is do exactly that. Provide the contemporary Russia perspective. Look at the culture, look at the economic environment, look at the mindset, the history. So I think more of that quality of programs is extremely needed right now. And another program that we've supported now for the past 5 years that I'm very proud to say that we've supported it. We don't provide a lot of funding, but it's consistent, and it's something that I feel, again, is much needed and not enough done. And that's Stanford U.S. Russia Forum. So it's a student organized forum that we've supported now again for 5 years, and for 4 years in a row we've brought them to Fort Ross, which is another big project of ours. That's a historic park in California that we've supported with a separate foundation for 5 years now. But the reason I'm mentioning it is because there's a group of students, a very diverse group of students, half and half Russian, half American, some undergraduate, some graduate, who come together once a year. They used to, and now twice a year, once in Stanford and Palo Alto, and once in Moscow, and they talk about a variety of issues. And whereas before it was U.S. Russia issues specifically, now it's issues. they're, you know, issues that are important in the world, and they're not U.S. Russia relations specific, but, you know, the issues where both countries can have an effect. But the Fort Ross component of it, I feel, is particularly important and should be taken into consideration by other programs. And that is because there, it's at that place where people-to-people connections start. And I feel that there's not enough of that in the current Russia Studies program. People, you know, they're experts who, I won't say for all of the experts, but there are a lot of experts who kind of speak at the students. They have some sort of exchange, but there's never, you know, this. The students who are studying Russian, the Russian language or culture, or more often the other issues, they don't have exposure to Russian. And so the things that I feel should be done is you can't have an effective Russian studies program without the Russians. And right now there are no Russians, or there are very few. Good that you're here. Then I also feel that there is no direct support from oftentimes there's no direct support from the highest administration of the university. And I have to give an example that we specifically experienced, and that's, you know, back to your comment on the no lack of desire from the Russian part. We're funders. We provide funding for a variety of things, but education as well. And so we approach, you know, a number of good quality entities like Stanford University and, you know, Columbia University and Yale. We've had a good partnership with Yale for years. And we support programs they already have that are Russia related, and a few months ago, I was, you know, we were in discussions with one of the top universities in New York about, you know, funding a few programs there, and I get a note from their dean who says, that's after the discussions have been going on for a while, who says of the climate between U.S. and Russia, given the Ukraine situation. And I find it silly, and it's counterproductive, and I feel it's not just about the funding, it's not just about, but it's about the openness, the open-mindedness of the discussion, and I feel that's what we're really lacking right now. I'll stop here.
Before we open up the discussion to our audience, I just want each of the panelists briefly say 1-2 things that need to be improved in order to dramatically improve the state or the field of the Russian studies in the U.S. today.
Well, I don't know if these will dramatically improve anything, but I'm hopeful that over time they might position Russian studies more appropriately. The thing that I've been struck with over time is how Russia has been removed from the component of European studies, because one of the courses that I teach is comparative European studies, and it's simply become difficult to find a textbook on European studies that still includes Russian. And that's unfortunate, because that is, for every cultural, historical, religious reason, exactly where Russia belongs. And this is precisely the kind of issue that has ramifications over a generation. So Russia does need to be brought into and anchored into Russian studies. Many of people who have commented talk about the importance of area studies. Steve Hansen gave up in his latest AAAS speech. He said he gave up on Russia's area studies and said, well, let's call it something else, call it regional studies. Whatever we call it, there needs to be some sort of interdisciplinary safe havens, at least let's call it that. You know, some place where the study of a region in an interdisciplinary fashion can be preserved, because, and I would think that government institutions and think tanks have as much, and businesses have as much vested interest in that as academics do. One thing that I drew attention to is the importance of having a broad and comprehensive discussion of the role of the media, because the media shapes public perception. It also shapes elite perceptions, it shapes government perceptions. I think it's entirely appropriate to talk about how reporting about Russia is done and the need for balanced reporting, because it is simply implausible that everything in any country can always be bad all the time. And this has led, in fact, and I believe a number of studies are beginning to show this, to a sense of disbelief about what the media is, the images the media is generating on many issues, not just Russian studies. And finally, more students, foreign students, but particularly American students, studying in Russia, getting degrees in economics, in geography, in many of the areas, and bringing those degrees home, combining a linguistic and area expertise with a practical expertise, I think would be very positive.
Thank you. Well, right now, this is time to open the panel for your questions. Please share your questions, insights, but try to be brief. Yes, please.
So my name is Elizabeth Wood, and I am a historian from MIT. I teach Russian history and politics, and I wanted to make a brief comment on what we're trying at MIT. We have a new program called the MIT Russia Program, and then ask the panel's advice. This MIT Russia program, one of the things about MIT is it's a premier science and technology university. That's what the students love is hands-on work. And so what we've got going is an exchange. It's not an exchange, it's one way, but we're placing students in Russian companies, Russian universities, and Russian institutes where they work in their own fields and learn how things are done in Russia. What we're trying to do is build more at all levels so that the students are going to Russia, the faculty, we're trying to develop seed funds so that the faculty can have important projects, which it would be good for Russia in terms of economic development, in terms of tech transfer, technological. We had faculty working on avian flu in Siberia, Japan, and the US. So it's important to do that kind of thing as well. And we've had the same good fortune that a couple of Russian universities have come to us and said, you know, we really, Misis and ITMO and Tomsk. So we're trying to find more and more ways to develop that, to broaden our offerings. We've fortunately had historians at the center of it. So we're not as plagued by the problem of too much theory building. We're trying very strongly to build it based on language and culture. But so the question is, in this context, we're still struggling a bit now this summer in a new way, and it's nobody's fault, with Russian companies that are shy about taking American students. They're saying, oh, do we have to have a special visa? And we say, no, it's an internship. The goal, they're not going to be paid by the Russian company. They're going to go, they're going to study, they're going to learn, they're going to bring something in. Vlezhit, what can they bring into the Russian context? So we're struggling with this polarization exactly at the moment when we think it's the most important. And here I want to emphasize what Olga Miller just said. You know, this is the time when we need to not polarize the context, but increase them. So I'm curious, how can we make the climate better for both sides in terms of infrastructure and understanding? Yes.
Quickly, Elizabeth, the language. Do these kids need to know
Yes.
Russian in order? Okay. So
They have to have 2 years of Russian. Occasionally we send one who doesn't if they have a really particular project, because they do better in Russia, and it's also part of a model that it's immersion in a country. Because I think that's the only way to really learn. I mean, you can take courses, but then you need to go.
So have you guys approached the U.S. Russia Business Council, for example, to help smooth things along and find partners that are interested in Russia?
Yep.
And that hasn't.
No, that has, but it's a constantly uneven process. So we need to, but they could certainly help us continue to streamline it. That's a very good idea.
That would be the first guys to go to. And then the Russian trade representation, that here in Washington would be another great resource to work with, because they can probably suggest partners in Russia, American companies, and Russian companies, of course, with an interest in taking in these.
American Russian Business Council in Moscow would be a good place. And another thing, I think it's just an interesting phenomenon that it is important to have some experience or to be exposed to Moscow and St. Petersburg. But I think it's almost as important and as interesting to approach companies throughout Russia. And those companies, and there are a lot of big ones in Ekaterinburg, Novosibirsk, Tomsk, and in smaller areas, but they may be more willing to partner because they don't have as much exposure, and they're usually even more interesting to work. I shouldn't say that. More interesting to work with, and they're more open-minded, and there could be a more enhanced experience for the students. So I would try that as well.
Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Toby Gonti. I want to introduce myself in a different way. I've been the beneficiary of government funding of these programs when I was at Columbia University, and I had taught some courses, not at Columbia, at a smaller school, and have a continuing interest in exchanges, NGOs, and actually administered the Title VIII program when I was in the government, and am now trying to fund a new program that would be in honor of Ambassador Robert Strauss, who was the first ambassador to the Russian Federation. And I just was reminded of that because we're definitely trying to do that in the area of business as opposed to strategic studies. Having said that, let me just say that it's a tragedy that the tensions in U.S.-Russia relations are leading to a closing of contacts. The shift from area studies in the U.S., you pointed to many of the reasons in your report, which is very comprehensive, and thank you for doing it, talking about the shift in political science in general, which is a major, major factor that has nothing to do with image of the enemy or whatever. And it's the reason I got a master's and not a PhD, because I couldn't bear the thought of spending 3 years talking about quantitative crap. Sorry for my colleagues who don't agree with that. So I think it's really important for you also to understand that there are people doing Russia and interested in Russia who haven't gone to these programs. I work at a law firm now. There are people who speak better Russian than a lot of the professors that I have. They're in business, they're in law, they are in trade, they're economics experts. So the pool is really it's a bit larger than just the programs you're talking about. I think that's an important factor. But I would also look at the other side of the coin. For example, in the Russian Federation, the cutting off of the FLEX program is a tragedy with a capital T. Why? Not just because the students come here, but how do you think Americans become interested in Russia? They meet Russians when they're in high school or in college, and then they say, this is really interesting. That's what happened to me. It was really in college. We had Russian in high school, but I didn't take it, frankly. But I did take it in college and then went on many of the programs. That's why you're interested in it. It's not because, the Soviet Union was the enemy. If you live in the middle of the United States, the Soviet Union didn't exist for you as an enemy. It existed as a source of scholarships in college. And that's all you cared about. So I think that's really important. I was a Russian literature major during the Cold War. I didn't do strategic studies. Nobody told me I had to study for the army or whatever. I just did it because I liked it. I think that's really important. Second point, I have 3 points. You talked about the analysis of a remedy, restoring Russia to European studies, discovery on common culture, putting Russia into Western identity. And I wonder if you've been reading your own policy statements about where Russia fits in the world, because many of them do not put Russia in that context. And I think it's really important to look at that. You've even had one of your Duma representatives talk about banning education in the English language. So we're really got a problem on both sides that I think is important to look at. Where does Russia fit? Well, if Russia can't figure out what its identity is, why are you surprised that America can't figure out what Russia's identity is? So my last point is, first of all, I want to compliment the embassy for knowing more about American programs probably than many Americans know. And I wonder if a U.S. Embassy person could talk as authoritatively about these programs or would have visited as many as you have. So I think it's really amazing. I think what we really need for the credibility of this study, and this is my recommendation, is to realize that fixing the U.S. side is not enough. And unless there is a parallel effort to examine Russian programs on U.S. studies, this effort is incomplete. We need methodology to do that. We need to pick, as you said, the 32 masters or whatever programs, and have a parallel, have more investments like the kind that Renova is doing in Yale, which is really wonderful. So I look forward to a similar study, and I hope Russia Direct would support it, and the embassy would support it on the state of American studies in Russia, because then you would have two groups of people who actually know what's being done in both countries, and you would be able to have a discussion which brought together people who are able to objectively look at the strengths and weaknesses on both sides.
Yeah, thank you so much for this comment. We actually plan to do this with regard to Russia, and this report was just the beginning of this much larger effort for us to analyze this academic point. Right. Yes, please.
My name is Caitlin Antrim. For the last 8 years, I've been working on American and Russian Arctic policy. And one of the things that Americans have a really difficult time is understanding the geography of the Russian Arctic. We've always thought of it as just a block of ice that we didn't have to worry about. Didn't have to worry about threats, didn't have to worry about what was going on up there. In one of my talks, I emphasized that one reason Americans can't understand it is we know in our hearts that rivers do not run north. And yet the 3 largest rivers and 3 of the 10 largest rivers in the world drain the largest watershed, which explains why the Arctic is important to Russia beyond having their largest naval base at one corner of the Arctic. It also leaves people still thinking that U.S.-Russia relations are between Washington and Moscow, and not understanding how Russian regions are managed, how Russian administrative provinces, crews, what role they have, what role culture has in each of those, and what makes them different. We understand it that somewhat in our own states, we don't have a clue as to how decisions are made at the regional level, at the local level, anywhere in Russia outside of Moscow and St. Petersburg. And when we've tried to build more partnership between Alaska and the Russian Arctic, we lose support from the capitals because they're going to be tied up in these strategic issues. We tried to build support for partnership before the Crimea era. And as soon as that happened, everyone snapped back into the old nemesis, that it was easy to define things. It's easy to make your point where you can say the other people are doing wrong. All of the Arctic stuff, we emphasize partnership. Our Coast Guard talks about the positive relationship they have with the Russian Coast Guard. But when I asked how many Russian speakers they have on board Coast Guard ships, he said, well, we are kind of weak there, which means they don't have very many. And if we want to have law enforcement crossing borders, we have to have that understanding, not just of the language, but of even the cultural issues involved in managing a natural resource, because Russia and the United States have different approaches to fisheries. So that I think that's a large part of what we need to do, is not just focus on the capital things that are defined so rigidly by security, but these things where we have something in common and understanding it. The more we could get people to think of the Russian approach to the Arctic as the American approach to the West 50 years ago, that helps in understanding too, or the role of the rivers and the role of Mississippi played in American development. There's some commonalities that will help us understand our differences. But if we don't approach them, we just look at these big strategic issues, which is all that gets in the press.
Yeah.
We won't get there.
Thank you. There was a question here. Oh, sorry.
Hello, my name is Olga Miller. I'm an associate professor at the Georgetown University's Languages Department. And I'm also the author of the book Yankees and Petrograd Bolsheviks in New York, American Americans and Russian Perception. Russian literary perception. And promoting the dialogue between Russia and America was my personal task, and I do what I can do teaching students. And I just wanted to share a recent initiative because I think that person-to-person contact, professor to professor, student to student, becomes more and more important in the current climate. And students can meet, American students can meet Russian students even without going to Russia. I introduced an element in my fourth level Russian course, Skype project. And our students learning Russian speak to Russian students via Skype. And they meet once a week. Some of the meetings are organized and take place in the language lab, but sometimes they meet person to person. And I have to say that my partners on the Russian side were Moscow State University and the Higher School of Economics. And students on both parts enrolled in this class with some preconceptions. It was really exciting to see how these mutual preconceptions were broken. They were destroyed during their actual contact.
Yelisa Bogoslavsky, George Washington Security Policy Studies Program. Like in this room, I felt that we were like slightly offensive to the American side of Eurasian studies. So my question is to like the Russian audience here. Well, it was said that there is this Cold War mindset and this image of nemesis. But actually, from the bottom-up approach, from the Russian side, we made a huge work to develop this image. We developed huge institutionalized networks like the Moscow Times or like other organizations, sending people like with the only purpose to create this very policy convenient image of this authoritarian, like crazy Russia. And my question to like participants of Russian academia here, could we actually do something to facilitate a real academic process from Russia to US, countering this image? Because like we are misleading the other side. We are creating a very tempting image that Americans follow just because it's like psychologically easy to follow like predetermined, prepared, convenient images. Could we somehow, I don't know, facilitate, yes, like exchange of professors who are not that policy oriented, or for example, oppositionist leaders who are not trying to spread Russophobic propaganda, but rather try to establish a real image what's going on in the country and use it as a part of bottom-up facilitator for development of real academic knowledge programs.
You know that the academician Fortov was here in Washington just a couple of years ago. He's a head of Russian Academy of Sciences. He had a number of meetings here in Washington, and in his one of his interviews, he said that you cannot stop the academic or scientific exchanges between our countries, like you cannot stop the river. You can poison the waters of the river, but the fresh spring produces of the fresh water every minute, so you cannot. I don't know the practical results of his visit, but the academician just confirmed that the exchanges between our two countries in this sphere almost didn't suffer. And they had mutual programs and projects, and so I cannot give you now the real examples of it, but the fact that the head of Russian Academy of Sciences was here, he met with his academician colleagues, with the administrative boards of the administration, so it's a good fact as it is. So if we have some practical results from this, but the confirmation that all the programs are working is a good sign in this atmosphere.
can give an example. My name is Andrei Sitov. I'm with TASS, the Russian news agency. I apologize for being late. I was still at work. We used to run an exchange program for journalists. The program was killed by the American side as part of the overall worsening of relations. I'm bringing this up for the simple reason that it's an interesting development since then. Since then, the Americans have tried to restart the program, have approached us with questions whether we are willing to do that. And the answer to that was, of course. But we need to do this not hiding behind around the corner somewhere or hiding behind a screen somewhere. We need to do it in the open, officially. It needs to be recognized and supported on both sides. And this Americans are not willing to do at this point, at least my understanding is. Because the moment they even tell you, surprisingly for me, they have the money for it. Like I had a call from somebody at the Voice of America. The person said, I run these programs, I have all the money you can ask for. Just give me partners. Are you willing to be our partners? I said, I'm sure my bosses would be willing, but you need to set it up officially. And then that's the end of it.
Well, I was just thinking about the way that the proposal was phrased in terms of finding people who are not Russophobic or of a particular political orientation. I think that would not be acceptable as a criteria to most academic institutions, which is why I think the broader, the more people involved and the broadening of context at every level, hopefully will provide for all of the diversity of opinions that can be expressed and should be expressed in these exchanges. It's very difficult to have either side sort of figure out who exactly is the right kind of participant, although there are obviously efforts to do that, but I don't think they actually do too much.
Thank you so much. I'm afraid we have to wrap it up because we've already been talking for an hour. I would like to thank.
Actually, think we have another 10-15 minutes for
really?
questions from the audience. Yeah.
Oh, good. Yeah, please.
I have a question. I believe Ms. Miller, you mentioned that we don't need more programs, but we do. My colleague and I do work at a small school and have some interest in establishing. I'm sorry, what?
What school?
Shenandoah University, about an hour and a half west of here. And if we were interested in starting a Russian language program, I don't even know where to start. So we'll never be a Stanford, we'll never have that type of funding, we'll never have that type of expertise on campus, but just to start a basic language program. Do you all have suggestions?
I think you started, I mean, I'm not, I think you started best practices. You started programs that already are in existence and you just take the basic, I mean, you don't want to be at Stanford. You're beautiful as you are. And you take, you talk to people who have started, who have been successful, and you take what you have.
I can speak a little to that. I'm Graham Helling. I'm the director of higher education programs at the American Council for International Education, and also on the American Council of Research Projects. So we've been advocating. I think American councils have been advocating for almost 40 years for programs like I think the ones that many of the panelists are talking about, which are those that really try to engage students in substantive language learning and in-depth cultural studies and immersive experiences in Russia. To answer your question, I mean, the key for most Russian programs right now is finding enrollments and a way to pay your faculty. I mean, and that's why that's the challenge. There are things you can do. One is to get a Fulbright scholar to come. If you apply for a Fulbright, that's a great way to start, to jumpstart a Russian program. We are really facing a challenge right now, I think, in the field of Russian language study, and I was really interested to hear those comments about where we are with Russian language, because I think that's one of the really interesting things about the report is that it highlights the problems we face right now with Russian enrollments, and I think that's critical to what's an issue here, at least on the American side, is that there isn't the emphasis in general in language study in the United States today. Enrollments the MLA study, which you referred to, shows today only about 8 out of 100 students in the United States are studying foreign language, which is down from 16 out of 100 45 years ago. So we're not going in a good direction. And I think one of the challenges there is the problem of convenience. And this is something that we encounter international ed a lot, which is undergraduates are now told you have to do 5 different things, including getting an internship and doing a triple major. And therefore, no one wants to go to Russia for the time of involved in learning Russian because they don't want to be off campus as much. So people go for shorter and shorter term. It's harder and harder to get people on longer term programs, which is where I think the really critical lessons tend to take place and where you really want to see your students and where people who go on to become Russian specialists need to invest the time. And I think that's a really critical problem in higher ed today in America. It's getting students to understand the value of that extended time abroad. But to go back to your question of Fulbright is a good way to start. There are other ways to start with faculty, but again, a lot of the question is resources. And your institution, I think, is doing a commitment to the teaching on campus. And then there's the challenge of enrollments. If I could, I would appeal to the academics in the room too, just to, if you could, begin to question what people are talking about in study abroad and higher and global education today. I think there's this trend to talk more and more about globalization, but it increasingly lacks substance. Again, language enrollments are going down while more and more universities talk about being global environments, but what does that mean? I don't think anybody's really interrogating that nearly enough. And the numbers for study abroad, the study refers to 300,000 students studied abroad last year, which is great. Those numbers are going up, but if you look closely, they're increasingly short term. The people that are going abroad for 2 weeks or less. That's the only place where there's scored out of study abroad. Academic year and semester programs are declining steadily, and I think people in higher ed need to be aware of that to really begin to push back on that question of what does it mean to really study a language and a culture.
Yeah, I'd just like to say that Graham sent me to Moscow to EKGU to run the Russian American Academic Center for American Studies. So that answers your point. I think he did a fabulous job. There is a serious issue, and I think there's a larger issue, having been teaching American studies in Russia, then becoming interested in Russia when I came back. Basically, and this goes to your point of political correctness and theory, because I took some courses at CSIS after coming back. Russia is a country that does not have institutionalized political correctness in all of our media, business, journalism, academia. And Russia is basically a post-politically correct society because it's post-communist. And they had it and they don't want it anymore. We haven't fully had it yet. So we're on the other side of that curve. The Americans look at Russia and see Putin is Mayor Richard J. Daley of Chicago. America is Tom Hayden and Abby Hoffman. It's 1968. It's the Democratic National Convention. And that's it. And until you deal with that, I don't think there's going to be any progress. I don't know what the answer is, but I do think exactly the literature is wonderful. The cultural is wonderful. The history, you know, Russians have been through what we are about to experience. And it's a very interesting situation because no one can deal with it because in the academy and all of our major institutions, there's a code of omerta or silence. I can say when I came back, I published an article. My Russian students did not want to hear about democratization. They were not interested. They're very interested in the clash of civilizations. I went to Angela Stent's seminar at Georgetown to sit in, and she was talking about Chechnya. And I said, gee, you know, when I was in Russia, they thought the Chechens were terrorists. She said, you must never use the word terrorist when referring to a Chechen. I said, but why not? This is a free country. This is the United States of America. We can say whatever we like. If I want to say they're terrorists, I can say they're terrorists. Anyway, no, it was forbidden. I left the seminar. I never went back. And of course, Chechen terrorists blew up the marathon in Boston. So we have a problem of theory dictating reality, and only experience will be able to counter that. And it's very difficult. And this is finally what I said to your journalist here. The other problem is the Russians don't pay for anything. When I went to Moscow, the Americans weren't paying because of Iraq. I went for free. I got some Russian lessons in a dorm room, which we had to give up. And we moved and paid rent in a nice artist's dome near Bolshoi Theater. But you can't expect people to do something for nothing, you know? In other words, if the Russians would spend as much as we spend on Fulbright and so forth, if the Russians would pay for the Bob Strauss fellowships, just, you know, you buy sports teams, you have Ovechkin, you have this, you have $100 million apartments in New York City. If you spend that kind of money on true educational exchange, I think you get a lot of return. And exactly, at the Shenandoah colleges, at all the little places, you know, it doesn't take that much, but people need to be able to live. So let's get off my high horse, but work with Excels, fund them fully, set up name fellowships, etc.
Thank you. We actually have a couple of questions
From Twitter.
The first one, does the U.S. EU sanctions affect in any way the Russian studies programs? Yeah, Jeff, can you?
Okay. I'm not aware that they directly affect these programs. Obviously, some of the indirect level, obviously some of the things that colleague Fedyashin was talking about in terms of how, you know, negotiations on visa liberalization and that sort of thing have been put on hiatus by the crisis in relations have an impact, and the general climate of suspicion that I think exists on both sides. You know, I'm a historian by training, and, you know, talking to my historian friends who are trying to do research in Russia now, it's become much more difficult. Access to materials is increasingly restricted, you know, more check of people's visa status, and people being, you know, fined and deported from the country for having the wrong visa status. I mean, all of these things that have gone on for a long time, people coming in with perhaps the wrong credentials, but it's been sort of overlooked just because it was never a priority. I mean, now those things being enforced in a way that's creating, I think, a climate where people are more concerned, where they're more frustrated, and I think it sends a message to people who are aspiring to go into these fields that Russia's a difficult place to work. That it's not that the overall climate in relations is making Russian studies more difficult, and that you should maybe focus somewhere else. I think all these are kind of indirect consequences of the cooling in relations that we've had over the last couple of years. But I don't think the sanctions per se are part of that.
Thank you. And we actually had also a question from our reader. It was submitted a few days before the discussion, and it is for you, Oleg. Does the Russian embassy plan to do something to support Russian studies?
We do not plan anything new. We're just working on this on an everyday basis. Our institutional frameworks here in the embassy are not so bad. We have a number of groups working on different directions of educational exchanges and business sphere. Maria Antonova is here from the economic group, and Oleg is here. He is the head of everybody know him. He is the head of our Russian Cultural Center, 5 minutes walk from here. So he is doing everyday job on developing Russian culture, Russian language, Russian programs here in the United States. So it looks not so bad, but as I mentioned, we have, you are right, some small money just from the budget to help that or this project here. It's not much. So, but we do not interfere in the substance of the projects, of the fresh ideas. I can just give the best example of what is where we can help, not with money, but just maybe institutionally. And this is what Anton Fedyashin represents here. His and Susan Lerman's project, newly established institute, Carmel Institute of Russian Culture
and History.
Yes, this is for us, and we communicate almost every day, trying to help to somehow. I don't know. On the opposite, the institute helps embassy in different projects. But this is the most fresh and ambitious project now after this year's project. Please pay attention to this. It's very, very new ideas has been produced here in this center. We went how many hundreds of American students, 3 or 4 or 5 thousands of students went through the Russian cultural club with looking how do you call this program? Russian classical movies.
That's we did part of the whole culture and history exposure. So that's
it's a treasury of Russian culture, and thousands of American students looked at it Russian classical movies about the Great War or pre-war films after war. We have a number of film movies by Karen Shakhnazarov, you know him, the students saw all of his movies here. It's one of the examples, but it's a great example, just an initiative from the American side, and what we can do with just to support.
We also send students to Russia every summer to go to the summer programs at GIMO and the Higher School of Economics. And we sent 10 kids last summer. We're sending 10 more this summer, but we give them money. So money, of course, is always the issue. But we have a private donor who's very generous and who had a great vision for the cultural and historical exchange, including the screenings at the Russian embassy with Q&A afterwards with American experts discussing the historical and cultural context of the films. But listen, we've been in existence for 4 years. We've had almost 15,000 people come to our events because the Tanla Theater, which the embassy so generously provides, opens up for us, seats 350, and we raise 350 guests who attend these screenings every single time. We do 3 semesters, so it's been a spectacularly successful program. I also noticed the 70 years article there. We just had a symposium celebrating the U.S. Russian cooperation during the Second World War about 2 weeks ago. So there's an enormous amount of thirst for all things Russian among American students. It's just a question of finding the money to satisfy that thirst. And most importantly for us, for example, we want to send them to Russia so that they can experience it for themselves as it is, not as it isn't or how it should be, but as it is. That seems to be a very constructive way to start engaging foreign countries.
One comment I would just make in reference to the media coverage of recent events too is we have a group of students in Moscow today studying Russian who, as the sort of program keeping up over recent events, have written repeatedly to me and to other people in the media asking to sort of have a forum to talk about how they see Russian-American relations based on their daily interactions and how different that experience is from the sort of media images. And there seems to be no interest. So it's very difficult to find, kind of, I think, an outlet sometimes for people who do have a different experience right now, which is disappointing.
That's interesting, sorry, that you mentioned it, because we right now are accepting essays from students. Yes, it's a student essay competition. We hold it twice a year, and please tell your students about that. We will be happy to read them.
That's precisely the sort of thing that I think a journalism foundation would probably be interested in. And if you just got some veteran reporters, people who have dealt with Russian government and academia, and their counterparts from Russia around a table to discuss the issue of reporting and how it affects our general climate, I think that would be spectacular.
I think I would take it further. This is something that, I've discussed with a number of people for many years now, and it just doesn't come to fruition. But there's a German house, there's Spanish house, there's a Korea society, there's you name it, and there's no Russia house. And I think Russia, we really need a Russia house where we can discuss Russian studies, where we can discuss journalism, where we can discuss economic issues, where we can convene on both sides, or, you know, where we can, you know, have cultural events, where we can show movies, and we don't have it. And it's.
You mean on
I think
campus?
it's-
You mean,
On
yeah, or do you
campus.
mean in
on
DC?
campus, I think.
If they have it, cultural
need
center
a-
here.
Yeah, I think we need something that with one platform that is independently funded. And I think it would be ideal if it was funded, you know, 50% by the American side and 50% by the Russian side, but I don't think it's important. I think it should be independently funded, and where people, you know, it would be a platform where people would convene and discuss and have exhibits and have, so it would be an all-encompassing platform. I don't think academic only is enough.
Something like Alliance Française.
Like Alliance Française.
Thank you so much. I would like to thank our panelists for their answers, and I would like our audience for participating. We do think that it's important to discuss this topic right now and to attract more attention to this issue. And as I said, we plan to keep covering this topic and try to analyze American studies in Russia at Russia Direct. I also would like to thank our partners from Foreign Policy for providing this space. And remind you that you can download our report if you haven't read it yet from our website from the archive section. Thank you so much.
We also invite you to have some coffee before you leave, and we thank our live audience.
We can